Hello YouTube! Today I'm going to explain why I wanted to upgrade from the Panasonic GM1 and why I ended up getting a Panasonic G7 out of all of these different options. And I'm going to go over all of these specs and what they are lacking, what are the pros and cons of each of these cameras. But first, what were the shortcomings of the Panasonic GM1? First of all, because it's a little camera, it can be a bit awkward to hold sometimes. When you put a relatively big lens on it, it just looks kind of silly and it feels pretty heavy to hold because it doesn't really have a grip on it. If you are interested in shooting a lot of video with your camera, you might not take the GM1 because it only has a fixed screen here, while a lot of other cameras will have tilting screens or, in this case, a fully articulating screen. Next, we will go over all these cameras and I will tell why exactly I chose the Panasonic G7.
Here we are in dpreview.com, where I have selected 18 different cameras which we will compare against one another. First up, we have the most obvious choice, the Panasonic GH4. The GH4 is very similar to G7, but it's a lot more expensive, and I don't think it's worth it to pay the extra here. There are four main differences between these two cameras. First of all, the GH4 can do extra wide 4K, but that's not really helpful if you plan on uploading your videos to YouTube. The next difference is that the GH4 has a headphone port which the G7 lacks, but you can work around that pretty easily. The third one, which is a major one, is that the GH4 is environmentally sealed. The fourth one is that the GH4 has a lot better battery life than the G7. There are some downsides to the GH4 though. It's a lot heavier, it is bigger. Also, I have read that the G7 has better noise performance. In my opinion, the biggest difference is the price difference, so the GH4 isn't the one for me. Next, we have the Panasonic FZ300 and the Nikon P900. You can't change the lens in these cameras. At first, these cameras look like a very solid option because they have such a huge zoom range. And the focal length is amazing. Even the maximum aperture is pretty good, so you would think that these cameras have splendid low light performance. Actually, these numbers are misleading because the manufacturer is giving the focal length in terms of full frame sensors, but they have left the aperture unconverted. So let's convert the aperture to the real value, which is in full frame terms. The sensor size is tiny on these cameras. Even the 4/3 sensor is pretty big compared to these. Here is a chart of different sensor sizes. The biggest rectangle here is the full frame sensor. A lot of professional cameras use these. The most common, however, is the APS-C standard sensor. The micro 4/3 sensor, which we have in the Panasonic GH4 and G7 for example, is not that much smaller than the APS-C sensor. However, the Panasonic FZ300 and the Nikon P900 have a tiny sensor which is comparable to smartphone sensors. This will have an effect on the low light capabilities of the sensor and also depth of field. Tiny sensor size can be taken into account if you multiply the aperture number with the crop factor. The sensor we have in the FZ300 and the P900 is this one, so we'll have to multiply the aperture value with 5.62. When the crop factor is taken into account, this becomes something like f16 and this f16 to f36. That's not impressive at all. I wouldn't recommend anyone to get a camera with such a small sensor size. And so, we'll have to dismiss both of these cameras. The next candidates are Nikon DL24-500, the Sony RX100 IV, and the Canon G7X Mark II. All of these cameras have a 1-inch sensor, which is acceptable in my opinion. Here we can see the sensor size in these cameras. If we go back to this chart, we can see that 1-inch sensor has a crop factor of 2.7. The maximum aperture numbers are very good on these cameras. If we multiply these with the crop factor, we won't get such poor results this time. The full frame converted aperture values range from f5 to f8. This isn't bad if you take into account that the cameras are so small and portable. These small cameras do have a weakness, however, and that is the focal length. They are not interchangeable lens cameras, so you'll be stuck with these values. Since I wanted a more flexible camera, I couldn't buy one of these. For example, the Panasonic G7 comes with a kit lens with an equivalent focal length of 24 to 280 mm with similar aperture values. The next two cameras are the Nikon D2300 and the Nikon D5500. If I was looking for a still camera, not a video camera, I would have bought the Nikon D5500. Both of these cameras have a larger sensor than the Micro Four Thirds sensor. The Nikon D5500 seems to have everything. It has a fully articulated screen, it has a touchscreen, its battery life is excellent. It isn't that heavy or big either. But the Nikon D3300 and the D5500 share a common flaw. They can only record from 10 to 20 minutes of video depending on the resolution. Most of the other cameras here can record 30 minutes regardless of the quality. Next we have the Canon 70D, which is lauded for its video capabilities. A lot of YouTubers use this camera. However, it only takes 1080p video at 30 frames per second. I wondered if it makes a difference if you record your video at 1080p or 4K resolution if you are going to downsample it to 1080p. But surprisingly, all of these 4K cameras take far sharper video than any of these 1080p cameras. You can really tell the difference if the raw footage has been recorded in 4K or 1080p, even if you downsampled it to 1080p footage and uploaded it to YouTube in 1080p 5 megabits per second bitrate. When you upload your video to YouTube in 4K, however, it increases the bitrate to 24 megabits per second. After I saw the comparisons, I couldn't consider any of these 1080p cameras for serious video work. Being able to record 4K is a deal breaker in my opinion. From now on, I'm only going to go over cameras which record 4K. Just 5 contenders left. Next camera is the Panasonic GX85. The GX85 has in-body image stabilization and can use the lens stabilization as well if you have both of these. But the GX85 lacks a fully articulated screen and also a microphone port. It's pretty lacking in the battery life department as well. So again, we have a nice still camera, but not necessarily a great video camera. Up next we have the Sony A6300. There's really nothing wrong with this camera. It takes great video and great pictures. The problem with Sony A6300 is that it doesn't come with a lens with such wide focal length range. If I wanted to get this camera with a lens that can do both wide and telephoto angles, I would have to buy the camera for 1100 and the lens for 600 euros. That's 1700 euros, and I don't think it's a good value at that price point. If I wanted to buy a camera that is a bit more expensive, I would buy the Sony RX10 Mark II. The lowest price I could find for this was 1300 euros. This camera has some great features. It holds the equivalent maximum aperture of f8 in its whole zoom range. Another solid feature is that you can record really good slow motion videos with it. The only reason I didn't get this camera was that the price tag of 1300 euros was a bit over my budget. The next camera the Nikon DL24-500 seems like a very promising option, but its release got postponed. At the time of making this video, there weren't any reviews about this camera. Be sure to check it out if you are buying a camera with great video capabilities in the near future. The last camera, the Panasonic FZ1000, is pretty similar to the G7 in terms of features. It records 4K and it has a good zoom range, adequate aperture values and a fully articulating screen. Its size and battery life are also similar. The downside of the FZ1000 is that it isn't an interchangeable lens camera, and the lens it has is reported to be very noisy. There are lots of examples in YouTube where you can clearly hear the focusing and image stabilization motors in more quiet videos. This is a big problem in my opinion, and that's why the G7 is a better option. In the end, I decided to buy the G7 and I have been using it for 3 weeks now. I'm really glad I got this camera, and it has fully met my expectations. Like pretty much all of the other cameras, it does have a surprising weakness however, especially when combined with the 14 to 140mm lens. It suffers from a phenomenon called shutter shock. I have confirmed this in my own testing, and that will be the topic of the next video, where I will compare images with and without shutter shock.